When Pope Leo XIV refused to shake Zohran Mamdani's hand during their first ever meeting at the Vatican, the world didn't just react, it held its breath. This wasn't a handshake denied to a diplomat. It was a gesture withheld from one of the most outspoken political disruptors of his generation, an elected socialist, a son of immigrants, a critic of empire. Mamdani had come with conviction. The Pope met him with silence. In a room crowded with cameras, Vatican aides, and journalists eager for spectacle, Mamdani approached with quiet resolve. His hand extended, his posture firm but respectful. His greeting was clear. But Pope Leo XIV didn't stand. He didn't reach. His hands remained folded in his lap, his expression unshaken. The silence that followed was seismic. No cardinal spoke. No press member stirred. Not even Mamdani's aides shifted. It was a moment that had been expected to mark progress. The first American pope greeting one of America's most radical elected voices. Instead, it became something else entirely. A collision not of politics, but of principles. But before we return to that instant, the poised hand and the Pope who refused it, ask yourself something. If conviction cost you the performance, would you still pay? This is a story of what happens when belief runs deeper than optics, when two worlds meet not to shake hands, but to test truth. It had been just 5 days since Leo XIV, now Pope Leo XIV, appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, an American pope, unprecedented and largely unexpected. His election had baffled analysts. He wore plain black instead of gold, refused the papal throne, ate at a wooden table in a bare room, and spoke more of sacrifice than sovereignty. The only crown he acknowledged was the one woven with thorns. That morning he knelt alone in the Sinai chapel, whispering from the Gospel of John. Light poured through stained glass above him when a Vatican aide stepped in quietly. "Your Holiness," the aide bowed low, "Zohran Mamdani has requested an audience. He is en route to Rome. No formal delegation, no staff, just him." The Pope opened his eyes, rose slowly, and dusted off his cassock sleeves. "The assemblyman from New York?" "Yes, Holy Father. He says he wishes to offer his congratulations in person." "Then prepare the room," Leo said, turning toward the altar. "But this meeting will follow a different protocol." "Shall I inform the press?" Leo XIV paused, voice clear. "No need. The world will hear of it soon enough." Meanwhile, high above the Mediterranean, Mamdani sat aboard a modest chartered plane, scribbling edits on a worn legal pad. His prepared remarks were sharp, more manifesto than congratulation. Faith, power, justice. He intended to say them all. "This isn't diplomacy," he told his aide. "This is confrontation cloaked in courtesy. But I'm not here to perform for tradition. I'm here to challenge it." His assistant glanced up nervously. "Assemblyman, this pope isn't like the others. He doesn't play to expectation." "Neither do I," Mamdani said, setting the pen down. "And conviction doesn't wear robes or suits." By the time word of his visit reached the Vatican, the headlines were already multiplying. Radical assemblyman confronts first American pope. Politics meets papacy. Will sparks fly or silence fall? The ceremonial hall was prepared with chilling precision. Cameras mounted, chairs placed, guards posted, tension rising. Pope Leo XIV sat in quiet contemplation, wearing only a red mozzetta and a plain black cassock. No gold, no splendor, only substance. The door opened. Zohran Mamdani entered, composed, steady, dressed plainly but deliberately. Cameras clicked. He offered no grand gestures, just presence. He walked directly to the Pope, extended his hand, and spoke with calm conviction. "Your Holiness," he said, "as a citizen of the country that formed us both, I offer you my greetings, not in ceremony, but in solidarity." The Pope didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't reach. He simply looked at Mamdani's outstretched hand, then back into his eyes and kept his own hands resting calmly in his lap. The air changed, stiff, charged, almost brittle. Cameras snapped in a frenzy. Mamdani's hand hovered midair, unanswered, unresolved. 3 seconds passed. He slowly withdrew it. His expression didn't break. But something behind his eyes shifted. Less confusion, more calculation. Less offense, more weight. "I see," he said quietly. Then, in a move that defied every headline waiting to be written, Pope Leo XIV stood, not to greet Mamdani, but to step aside. He walked slowly toward a small wooden table set discreetly to the side of the chamber. On the table sat a silver basin, a folded white towel, and a clay pitcher of water. Without a word, the Pope began rolling up his sleeves. Then he spoke. "Assemblymen," his voice calm but unwavering, "I did not come here to exchange gestures designed for cameras. I came to offer something older than applause." He gestured to the basin. "If you're willing, I invite you into a ritual far older than nations." The room froze. A moment that had been staged for spectacle suddenly swerved into something no one had prepared for. Not his staff, not the Vatican officials, not the press. Zohran Mamdani, usually poised, stood motionless. The silver shimmer of the basin caught the marble light spilling through the windows of the apostolic palace. The Pope's sleeves were now rolled past the elbows. His hands hovered patiently above the still, empty basin, waiting. Whispers darted across the room. A Vatican advisor murmured a prayer under his breath. Journalists leaned in, microphones edged forward, and Mamdani stood still, not in defiance, not in fear, but in a moment of interior reckoning. He finally spoke, voice low, steady, and not without tension. "Your Holiness," he said, "this isn't what I expected." "No," Pope Leo replied, "it isn't what any of us expected. That's why it matters." A journalist's pen dropped to the floor. No one flinched. The room was no longer political theater. It had become something else, something ancient. Leo stepped aside and motioned gently to the opposite side of the basin. "Leadership," he said, "is not found in the strength of our grip." He glanced briefly at Mamdani's still unshaken hand, "but in the humility of our touch." Mamdani hesitated. Every instinct in him said walk away. This wasn't strategy. It wasn't optics. It wasn't his ground. Back home, he was the voice of the unbowed, the loud conscience in a quiet room. He didn't kneel, and yet, something in the Pope's stillness unsettled him. Not dominance, not showmanship, something else. Mamdani took a slow breath, then walked to the basin. A visible ripple passed through the room. The press leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. Even cardinals stopped breathing. He now stood directly across from Pope Leo. Then the Pope lifted the pitcher and began to pour. The sound of water striking silver rang through the chamber like a bell. "In the Gospel of John," the Pope said, his voice soft but firm, "Jesus washed the feet of those who followed him, not because he had to, but because no leader is above those they serve." He dipped his hands into the basin, then turned toward Mamdani. Their eyes locked. No more words. Zohran Mamdani reached for the towel, and for the first time in his public life, he bent. Not as performance, not as submission, but as something undeniably human. He took the Pope's wet hands and dried them slowly, deliberately. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't choreographed, it was uncomfortable. It was real. When he finished, the Pope took the towel and did the same. He washed the hands that once clutched protest signs, the hands that pointed at injustice in chambers of power, the hands that had never once been washed by anyone else in service. And in that quiet exchange, something deep shifted. No one clapped, no one tweeted, no one moved. Because for a moment, just a moment, no one in the room was sure what had just happened. But everyone knew it meant something they hadn't seen before. The Pope turned to the press, not with contempt, but with calm invitation. "Now," he said simply, "we may speak." He motioned to an aide. "Let them all back in." The side doors opened. Reporters filed in quietly, their energy tempered by what they had just witnessed through the glass. No one shouted. "Your Holiness," a woman asked, "some say your gesture diminished him as a leader, that it was an act of dominance, not humility." The Pope turned slowly toward her. "If humility feels like dominance," he said, "perhaps the world has misunderstood both." The line landed like a stone dropped in still water. Another question followed, slower this time. "Why water? Why a ritual like this?" The Pope lifted his hand slightly. Because water purifies, because it humbles, because it binds. In every sacred text, water is the first act of creation, the first step toward renewal. If we cannot stand at the same basin, we cannot lead from the same well. Mamdani looked down at his hands again. I didn't come here expecting to be humbled, he said. And I don't agree with the church on everything. But today reminded me of something my father used to say back in Uganda. If your pride speaks louder than your conscience, you're not leading, you're selling. Silence again. But this time it wasn't awkward, it was mutual respect. A final question came, hesitant. Assemblyman, would you do it again? Mamdani didn't flinch. Yes, he said. And not because it was easy, because it wasn't. The Pope nodded once. True transformation, Etienne said, begins where comfort ends. The line moved like fire. Within minutes it was subtitled, quoted, reposted, translated. The headline changed. No longer, Pope rejects radical politician. Now it was something else entirely. Faith and fire meet at the basin. By then, it was no longer about a denied handshake. It had become something deeper. A pope and a politician rediscovering leadership through humility, and still they had only just begun to speak. As the media frenzy buzzed on, something remarkable occurred. The press stopped interrupting. They started listening. A BBC journalist cautiously raised her hand. Your Holiness, she began. Some political commentators are saying your actions today set a dangerous precedent, blurring the lines between church and state, between faith and performance. How do you respond? Pope Leo XIV folded his hands. Faith is not performance, he said, and service is not theater. What you witnessed today was not the merging of religion and politics. It was the separation of both from spectacle. He glanced toward Mamdani. What he offered was not submission, it was courage. Mamdani remained silent, but his presence was heavy with thought. There was no trace of calculation on his face, just stillness and something like relief. Another reporter stood. Assemblyman, she asked, as a progressive Muslim in office, did you feel challenged by this setting? Did this moment feel like an attempt to diminish your voice of the host? Mamdani responded without pause. No, he said clearly. It didn't feel like a challenge to my beliefs. It felt like a test, not of power, but of presence. And in that moment, I chose to show up, not show off. The room absorbed it. This wasn't a press conference anymore. It was something closer to a reckoning. The lines between left and right, between priest and politician, tradition and transformation, blurred, then redrew themselves. A hand rose near the Vatican press pool. Pope Leo, is this the new face of Vatican diplomacy? Unpredictable, personal, symbolic? His reply was instant. It is not diplomacy, he said. It is discipleship. The church does not engage in stunts. It engages in truth. And the truth is, the world is tired of handshakes that mean nothing. Then came a question from the back. Your Holiness, what does it mean that he said yes? The Pope turned back to Mamdani. It means transformation is still possible. That pride can bend. That faith, real faith, doesn't care how powerful you are. It only asks, will you kneel at the basin? Several reporters lowered their pens. For a fleeting moment, it no longer felt like journalism. It felt like witnessing something sacred. Then Mamdani spoke. My entire life, he said, I've been told that strength is control, that to lead, I had to hold ground, never yield. He looked directly into the camera lenses. But today, I learned something else. Strength without surrender is just fear in a suit. And if my constituents take anything from this, let it be this. Don't confuse noise with leadership. Don't mistake confidence for character. I'm still learning, and I hope I never stop. The Pope placed a hand over his heart. True leaders, he said, do not command from a distance. They serve shoulder to shoulder. And today, the world saw that. Outside St. Peter's Square remained packed. No one chanted, no one shouted. They weren't waiting for a headline. They were waiting for hope. The press conference ended not with applause, but with quiet nods. Cameras powered down, aides stepped forward to escort the two men from the hall. But instead of splitting into separate paths, Pope Leo XIV turned to Mamdani and gestured down a narrow corridor. "No microphones," he said, "no cameras. Just you and me." Mamdani hesitated. Just a second, then followed. They walked together through a cloister passage, past the echoes of centuries, until they entered a small private chapel. A single candle flickered beneath a plain wooden crucifix. No gold, no spectacle, just silence. "I wasn't ready for this," Mamdani said quietly. "No one ever is," the Pope replied, kneeling at the front pew. Mamdani stood behind him, unsure, perhaps for the first time in years, how to be still without performing. "I came here thinking I'd be in control," Mamdani said. "You still are," the Pope replied. "But the real question is, what kind of control do you want?" Mamdani sat beside him, the two of them facing the candlelit crucifix in silence. "For years," Mamdani said slowly, "I've told people I wanted to lead, to change things, to speak for the forgotten." "And today?" the Pope asked gently. Zohran looked toward the flame, toward the cross, toward everything that had just happened. "Today I realized I've been trying to control the world as well," he said, "but I haven't let anything change me." The Pope smiled softly. "Then maybe today was the beginning," he said, "not the end." A knock sounded softly at the chapel door. A Vatican aide peeked in, but Pope Leo waved him off. Then he reached into the sleeve of his cassock and pulled out a small, hand-carved object. A rosary, aged olive wood, dark with time. "This was given to me," he said, "by a woman in Palestine. She had lost 3 sons to conflict. She had nothing left but her faith, and even that was enough to share." He placed the rosary gently into Mamdani's hand. "This is not a token," the Pope said. "It's a reminder of what you already know deep inside." Mamdani closed his fingers around the smooth wood. "I don't even know how to pray," he whispered. "You just did," Leo replied. Mamdani laughed, softly, almost sheepishly, somewhere between discomfort and awe. "You surprised me, Pope Leo." The Pope smiled. "You surprised me too. Most people run from what they don't expect. You walked into it." Then his voice shifted, firmer. "The cameras are off. The sound bites are over. So let me ask you plainly. Why did you stay? Why not leave when I refused your handshake?" Mamdani looked down for a long time before answering. "Because in that moment, it didn't feel like rejection," he said. "It felt like challenge, and I didn't want to fail it." Leo nodded once, slowly, deliberately. "And you didn't." The candle between them flickered. The silence stretched, not tense but full. Outside, the world spun on. News anchors speculated. Commentators debated. Strategists scrambled. But inside that quiet chapel, a pope and a politician simply sat. No titles, no podiums, no choreography. Just 2 men, chosen by millions, finally learning what it meant to be small in the presence of something greater. The chapel doors opened slowly. Aides were waiting, silent, respectful. The atmosphere outside had changed. The reporters who had once craved spectacle now held their equipment more carefully, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Pope Leo XIV and Zohran Mamdani emerged side by side. No entourage, no statement, just presence. A journalist called out softly, "Assemblyman Mamdani, will you be issuing a statement?" Mamdani paused. He looked to the Pope, then turned back. "No," he said, "because for once, words aren't enough." The crowd in St. Peter's Square, pilgrims, journalists, critics, believers, fell silent. Phones recorded, but no one shouted, no one pushed.